Okay, I think it's recording. Hello, class. So this is our first video of this semester's course on financial management of nonprofit organizations. And I'm pleased to introduce Laval Miller Wilson, who's the Executive Director of Pennsylvania Health Law Project. Laval is someone that I've worked with for a number of years. My firm serves as the outsourced CFO for Pennsylvania Health Law Project, and I've gotten to know Laval over the years and how well he does with understanding his numbers and working with budgets and just being really up to speed on the financial portion of his organization. So I wanted to invite him here so that he could explain his journey of how he came to be comfortable with dealing with the numbers, which are so important for him managing the organization. So first, Laval, thank you again. I really appreciate this. So can you just give a little bit of your background and what you do?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me be a part of the class, Joyce. I've been a practicing lawyer for 25 years. I graduated from University of Pennsylvania's law school in 1995 and didn't take a lick of financial management. It's not as though when I'm in law school, you learn financial management and how to run a business. You learn about practicing law. So what I have absorbed in terms of financial management, especially of nonprofits, at that time that I was in school has been basically on-the-job training. But I run the Pennsylvania Health Law Project. I've been here since 2009. And here means virtually, because in COVID, all of our 15-person staff across 3 offices in the state are working remotely. We're a nonprofit. We've been in existence for 25 plus years, and we deliver free legal services to low-income people that need help with health insurance. And we deliver our legal services telephonically. And we serve about 3,000 folks each year, doing hearings and counsel and appeal work, all telephonically. Before that, I spent 14 years representing kids in the juvenile justice and foster care systems at a place called Juvenile Law Center. And that was also a nonprofit. Those are the 2 jobs in terms of legal work that I've had over these past 25 years.
At Juvenile Law Center, what were your duties there, and were you involved with the finances at that point at any time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was not involved in the finances. I began as a fellowship attorney, and then was fortunate enough for them to keep me on. But during that time, the board was, staff were invited to attend board meetings. And so in those board meetings, presentations would come up about the audit. And over time, I started paying more and more attention to, frankly, where my paycheck was coming from and the different sources. And that would be important for me just to have a better understanding. But while I was there, again, this was 1995 to 2008, 2009, I also had the opportunity for service on other nonprofit boards, specifically Public Citizens for Children and Youth, which was then called Philadelphia Citizens for Children and Youth, PCCY. And they asked me to come onto their board. And that was, in some ways, as a board member versus a staff member, where I started to understand the fiduciary responsibilities of a board member and following along various, especially the financial statements. And that's, I think, where I got my first taste of just understanding the importance of financial statements and fiscal statements.
All right, okay. And did you serve on the finance committee there or the program committee?
Yeah, that's initially I also worked my way up. I started as a board member and then got more and more involved. And Shelley Yanoff had been the executive director at the time, and she asked if I'd like to serve on the executive committee. So on the executive committee, there's a lot of issues that come up. for because that's really the organization that the sub-organization that is responsible for many things. So I got a pretty good taste of the financial side, but I didn't work my way into that through the financial committee.
Okay. You said something interesting. You said that you started paying attention where your paycheck was coming from. So I'm assuming you meant the different grant programs. Can you talk about your experience with working with grant programs and how that interacts with staffing levels,
Yeah,
particularly at nonprofit organizations?
sure. I think that it just while I was at JLC at that time, I was asked to write grants or put grants together, my portion of the narrative that was going to support the projects that I was involved with. And then I would look at the budget, but basically left it to my executive director, who gladly took on the responsibility for the organization of saying, look, I'm going to raise the dollars. I just want you guys to work. And that was partly my leadership model, and frankly still is at PHLP. But I do think that as one gets, has longevity at an organization, you just want to do more to understand how you can contribute. Nonprofits, I think to some degree, are notorious in terms of sometimes the model of leadership that I just described is that the executive director lifts it all and does all the great work in terms of raising the dollars. And it's different from law firms, where at the law firm, you were expected to bill the hours and get your money and get your clients and develop those relationships. And in the nonprofit sector, or at least in terms of the legal service nonprofit, that really hasn't been expected. We don't generate fees, attorney fees at the Pennsylvania Health Law Project, and we really didn't do that at Juvenile Law Center for a simple reason that we lost a lot of cases. We fought the good fight, but we really didn't want to commit to fee generating, meaning that if you win, you get revenue from the litigants, because you just weren't going to win all that much. And it's so uncertain revenue that that's not a good way to run a nonprofit.
Okay. So when you became executive director at Pennsylvania Health Law Project, what were the steps that you took to become familiar with the finances of the organization?
Yeah, it was one thing, I was reluctant, let me say, before getting into the seat. And I started in 2009, and we had the Great Recession that was occurring. But even before I took the position, I was interviewed by them in 2008 in the fall, and got recruited, and people asked, oh, would you like to apply for this? And I said, no, I don't want to. I like Juvenile Law Center. But I got interested in the leadership opportunity of running my own organization. And like JLC, but didn't necessarily see the opportunity to lead there in the time period that I wanted to. So I got asked to become the executive director at PHLP, but I didn't accept right away. I asked for the audit. I asked for the organization and said, before I take this on, I need to have a better understanding of the finances. And that's something that I'm not quite sure, frankly, that many people do. If you're going to lead an organization, you really need to understand what its revenue sources are. And so I said to the committee, I need to take a look at your audit. And fortunately, when I asked for that in mid-October or late October, they had just finished their audit. So it was very timely. And I looked at it and looked at the 2008 numbers and said, okay, I see a number of diverse revenue streams that are coming in. Was I really good at unpacking an audit and understanding all the different aspects to it? No, but it was good enough. And I think one can read through it and get an understanding about the balance sheet of an organization and the different funding sources. And so that was really helpful for me in making me say, I think I can make this leap from an organization I'm comfortable with to another organization where I have a lot to learn, but I'm not going to be grappling with having to raise that many dollars. Well, then 2009 happened and the Great Recession happened. And I was definitely in the midst of trying to figure out how to raise money.
Yeah.
because it was very clear when I came in and I wrote some figures down. We had to, our revenue was down, we were dipping into net assets, and I had to immediately let a couple people go, attorneys that had been there for 5 years.
Mhm.
And I made that very hard decision. It was one of the hardest decisions I think I'd made, certainly for the organization, to lay folks off. But I looked at the revenue picture and realized I don't think we're gonna be able to, it's gonna be a big struggle.
Mhm.
And if we don't make a decision right away, it's gonna be a struggle for me, it's gonna be a struggle for the organization. So I made, with the board, a very hard decision to let some folks go right away. Folks that I was familiar with, but on the other hand, I didn't know all that well because I'd been only there for 3 months.
Okay. All right.
So, I mean, maybe that's more than the class wanted or you wanted, but it
Oh
certainly
no, I
was.
mean that's
It's
great
a jump.
actually. Yeah.
It's a
And there
jump
you
when you,
bring in all the terms that they're going to be learning over the next couple of weeks. So that's great. So they'll have to refer back to this interview. So so was your first I guess order of business finding out how to apply for grants or making sure you could raise enough money? I mean, what was your next step given that you were in this recession or the country was in this recession?
yeah, the country was in the recession, the state was in the recession, the state was starting to say, look, we need to cut back commitments that we've already made. All legal service programs are going to have some amount of reduction. And also I had applied for grants, and I remember a dark day in 2009 for a $100,000 grant with a funder that liked all the work that we were doing. Suddenly the funder pulled out and said, we're going to rethink our strategy altogether, and we're going to do a Southern strategy, Southern United States, because there's more need there than up here in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. So I was just hit. But I do think that you have to, in life and in this position, just keep going and acknowledge that it's a really bad day, but then get up and just keep trying to pitch for dollars and do the best that you can. So I had hoped when I made that commitment to laying off folks that I wouldn't have to lay off anyone else, and I didn't, but I definitely kept me up at night just thinking about that. Interestingly, in terms of back to financial, the people I laid off, and this wasn't the best thing, but the people I laid off, our direct services didn't suffer that much because I laid off folks that were I laid off one attorney that was kind of helping this program not balance the books, but handle payroll and financial. So at our organization, again, we've always been pretty small. We've always had a fiscal consultant who hasn't been on staff. And that's the arrangement that's worked for us. But at the same time, we do a lot of in-house understanding of books. And I had somebody that was running payroll and cutting checks for me to sign and go over the paperwork. When I asked that person to go, I had to take on all of that responsibility, cutting the checks, opening the bills in a cost-saving mode. But my ability to do that could only go for so long because you can't do everything in an organization. You can't raise money, you can't run a legal program, you can't print out all the checks. So my bandwidth, I quickly realized, was shortening. So I quickly realized I needed to bring in some more staff, but not necessarily at that high of a level to handle some of those just basic tasks that I was describing before. And to go on, I hired some whip smart students from college that had just graduated, and they were willing to go ahead and learn about how to manage it with my direction and the direction of a fiscal accountant that we had.
Okay.
So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that arrangement has worked out well for you.
It has. It's been working out for about 5 or 6 years where we have somebody that comes on for now, maybe a little longer, for 5 or 6 years. It's been working out. I really had four people that have been with us for 1.5 to 2 years that serve that function at my direction and now at the direction of the fiscal accountant that we have too.
Mm. Let's talk a minute about your approach to budgeting. When you're, in April, May, right before the end of your fiscal year, and you're trying to plan for the next year, it's not possible for a lot of nonprofit organizations to know what their revenues are going to be for the next year. So what's your approach to that?
My approach has mellowed with time. I have to say that I remember this from Juvenile Law Center and as well as in other boards that I've been on. You do your best to guess at a budget. Are you going to have all the money in hand? No. Um, you are optimistic and confident in your own organization's ability to raise dollars. You say to a board, if the board asks, Laval, are all these dollars raised? No, they're not raised yet, but we have a pretty good sense that we're going to be able to raise them. And hopefully you're an organization that has enough in net assets to cover, if not the full year, at least some of the amount, and recognize that you can dip into those net assets when you need to. So there is a mellowing that I have done over time. Now, in part, my mellowing has been helped by a good economy. And so I've been more confident that we've been able to raise dollars from a number of different sources. This is a really hard time for everyone in terms of the now 10 years later, we're back in some ways to the same approach. But here's the difference, I think, between 2020 and 2008 and 2009. I think philanthropy is much more sensitive to the plight of nonprofits. I see a lot of philanthropies just really coming to bat and trying to help nonprofits by saying, we're here for you. And a lot more focus with this economy on vulnerable people. So if that's your goal as a nonprofit, and typically it is, I'm not saying that there's going to be dollars there. I think this is still a hard time, especially with government contracts. And I think it's going to be even harder with state and local government contracts in the years ahead. But I think so far we've all been able to weather these last several months.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the challenge of the revenue side. But I go back to the expenditure side, which is if I need to pull the trigger, to use that kind of poor phrase, if I need to make a decision to lay off staff, I'm always willing to do that. I don't want to do it for the reasons I've said before, but I do think that has to go hand in hand to say, what are you willing to do in terms of cutting expenses?
Mm-hmm.
And some of that's been with regard to staff, and some of that you and I have had conversations where I've said, I want to cut some of my own salary. Is that going to make a huge difference in terms of the cut? Because we have pretty good salary parity. No, but frankly, it makes me feel a little better if I'm realizing I need to cut back on other people and maybe even lay someone off.
Mm-hmm.
It does sit with you, and at times I end up saying, okay, I need to cut back on some of my salary too.
Right. Right. Now, in terms of the annual audit, where you have an outside firm that's hired that comes in to audit the organization, can you talk about your process in dealing with the audit and what that means to you?
Sure. The audit is, I appreciate the audit, but it's a lot of work to go through an annual audit as our funders at times require. The importance of an audit to me is making sure that the funders realize that there's good financial management. It's really important to have an audit done to me annually. To me, meaning the organization, and to me, I think it's really important to have that and to have as much good findings of an audit as possible. That's something I've grown to appreciate over time, and grown to appreciate the strength of our own organization of never really having any sort of material weaknesses in the audit. So I really take that very seriously and put all the materials that are needed together for the auditors to come in. And it's we've worked with auditors for a number of years. It's a professional relationship, but it's a very serious one, and one that that has a lot of stakes associated with it. Our funders look at that audit, and they look at it very carefully, and if they see some things that catch their eye, I know they would go ahead and call us and say, what's going on? The other thing that we've paid more and more attention to is some funders are especially interested in timing of the audit. And so we've made a really bigger attempt to try and get all this stuff done in a compressed time period. It's fine. I think that's, in some ways the funder, I also have realized at times is always right. So if the funder's like, I need it on this day, you don't argue with the funder.
Right.
If the funder says, that's another piece of this. It's recognizing that you have different funding sources, and some funders are more particular than the other. And if you want to accept that money, you have to jump through those hoops in terms of how that funder wants to have proof that their money is spent. So it's not so much the auditor's fault, and you're an auditor, Joyce, and I wouldn't necessarily blame you for a bad finding. It's really on us to say, what's the contract say? You got a contract, whether it's a grant agreement or a state contract, and the state or the federal, whoever your funder is, says, pay attention to my contract. I want you to spend my money this particular way. And the auditor's job is to say, well, let me look at the contract and let me look at how you're spending, and did they match up? And if they don't, you don't shoot the messenger. You're like, well, okay. But you would also hope that auditors do have some flexibility to realize, okay, I see this organization put forth a good effort. And that's where I think sometimes things can get, I think it's an opportunity to use good judgment about an organization when they're coming in with the best of intentions and they tried. So fortunately, we haven't been in that situation, but that's my philosophy in looking at an audit. I appreciate it. I don't have disagreements really with the auditors much, and it's really important.
Right. So the last thing I want to touch on is, I know over the years you have always looked at the internal controls of your organization, how things get processed to make sure that the information is recorded correctly, and so that you can produce good financial statements so that you can use them to manage the organization. Can you tell me a little bit about your background or how you came to understand that process?
Again, I think it's a little bit of osmosis of just on the job and understanding the importance of integrity and reputation, and trying to show other funders. That's all they want to help you, but they want to make sure their money there's good stewardship of their money. And so when you look at an organization's internal controls, you're just trying to show as much as possible to the funder and to those asking questions. How do we make sure that our dollars are protected? How do we make sure that there's not fraud that's going on? I've been close to, not fraud, but I really value internal controls. To go back to what I was saying before, when I had to let folks go in 2009, which included that person that was helping me open the mail, I had to open the mail myself. And then I had to enter the check myself. And then I had to sign the check myself. That's not a good situation. That's not a good idea. But it was, as I mentioned before, short-lived. And the auditors said that too. They were like, look, Laval, we understand how you got there, but you need to try and tighten your internal controls. And I got what they were saying. And so we made that adjustment. And so, since then, I've really tried to be very clear about whose responsibility was whose as we got bigger and bigger.
Right.
All with the understanding of, you just read so much in the paper about people that mismanage funds. I don't know enough about their situations, but I know it's not a good idea for one person to have all that much power and responsibility.
Right.
It, you know, it's tempting, it's corrupting. It could be like, oh, well, I think I'll just take a little bit of this money and spend it on something else that's personal. No, you can't do that. But the importance of internal controls is to have all those different checks and balances playing against each other, even if you have the best of intentions for your organization.
Right.
So that's, you know, my personal philosophy on the internal controls. You really want to make sure that you have as many different folks internally, confidentially looking at things. So that's why, as a fiscal consultant, for you, you're taking a look at our controls and books, and then we have a project administrator that looks at that, and I do as well. It reminds me of separation of powers. You know, you just need to have all the different bodies look at it. I've learned over time that I think folks have to be patient with themselves, and hopefully they have people that are willing to be patient with them. But I learn a lot, and I tried to join other boards, even during my tenure at PHLP, because I'm still learning. So I've joined other nonprofit boards and leaned into finances. So I'm on the board for Inglis House. I'm on the board for the federally qualified health centers in Philadelphia. I joined those boards to do the substantive work of those organizations to support them, but I'm always looking out to say, oh, how do they manage their audit? What's different about their process than ours? And that's really helpful.
Okay, that's great. Well, Laval, you've covered our whole course. So all people have to do is listen to this every week, and they've got the course covered.
Well,
So,
it's good. It's really, I appreciate you, Joyce, and what you do, and the students that are taking an interest in this. And you should make sure you give folks my contact information if they want to reach out to me and have more perspective. I'm happy for folks in the field.
okay, that's great. We have a small class, so 10 people, so that they might do that.
I'm open to having conversations about it. I would say that regardless as to what your background is, but I'm especially interested in people of color that are interested in the field of finance and nonprofit work. There are a number of us, but I'm always open to that. But on the other hand, if you're not a person of color and you want to reach out to me, that's fine too.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your summer. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.